think it's an incredibly powerful film, but I'd love to know where it started. And I hear it started with a table.
Yes.
Right. Tell me more.
So I love to cook, and family and food and everything around sort of the celebration of feasting is very important to me. And a very good friend of mine who lives in Cornwall works with her husband in an auction house, and she called me and she said, "Kate, my God, these incredible tables come in." And she sometimes has the task of researching particularly interesting pieces that will come through the door. And she said, "This table, I have to tell you about it." I said, "Please do." She said it was in the home of Annie and Roland Penrose, brother and sister. And this was the big kitchen table where they would sit and cook and feast and fight and chat and everything else, I'm sure, that went on in, around, and probably on that table. And this table was in the home during the time that Lee and Roland had first met. And many celebrations would happen with Man Ray and Pablo Picasso and Max Ernst, Paul Eluard. And this was this table that hosted these surrealists. And I got the table. I was like, oh my God, I have to keep that living. And I sat down at this table and I thought, wow, Lee Miller, my God, Lee Miller. Why hasn't anyone ever made a film about her? Cut to 9 years later, I now know why nobody's made a film about her, because she lived so many lives. And so our job was to really try and figure out how to sum up the most important decade, really, of her life. Because this is a woman who, if you Google Lee Miller, it will say former muse of Man Ray, ex-model. That was a sliver of her life in her 20s. And what she did beyond that, so many people don't know about. And this time in her life, I do believe, is her most important work, her most important years. And I think it does define truly who she is. And my hope is that other generations of young people who perhaps don't know anything about her will discover her for the first time in a completely different way.
It does say so much about her, doesn't it? And I believe you spoke to Anthony, her son, in terms of preparing for this, who of course wrote a book about her. What did you learn from him that helped to inform both the production and your performance?
So Tony and I are very close now. He was a creative consultant on the film. He was very heavily involved with the entire process. And when I first went to meet him in 2015, I got out of my car at Farley Farmhouse, which is where those scenes between the young journalist and Lee take place. And I got out of the car, and there he was, because it's now an art archive of all of Lee's work. And he looked at me and he said, "I've hoped you'd play my mum since I saw you in Sense and Sensibility." Oh, wow. And I was like, oh my God, okay, Russia. So, and I realized very quickly for Tony that his life, being raised by Lee Miller as a young boy, was really difficult. She was a tricky parent. She had PTSD that took her right through a large part of her latter years. And being a mother was a struggle. And he does talk quite openly about the tough times. And I realized that in making this film, we had to somehow find a way to give him a conversation he never got to have with her. So he discovered who she truly was only after she had died. So his daughter Amy was born in 1977, and his wife was holding this 5-month-old Amy and said, "She doesn't look like you or me. I wonder if she looks like your mother. Go into that attic, Tony. There's got to be a baby picture of you somewhere in there." So he's like, okay. Up he goes to the attic and discovers boxes of 60,000 negatives of Lee's that she had locked away. Like so many people who had gone through the war, they just put it away and tried to forget. And there it was. And he has devoted his entire life to upholding her memory and celebrating who he now knows she truly was. And so there's something for him about the film that he almost now can't watch it because it's so moving to him that we were able to give him that piece, really.
I really love that structure, and it was a very moving ending for me, that revelation. I want to talk about your choice of director for this project, because Ellen Kuras, fantastic cinematographer, great eye, and as it turns out, an amazing director in her debut. And what brought you to her? Because you'd worked together before, hadn't you?
Yeah, so Ellen was the cinematographer on Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind back in 2003, and then we became really good friends. And, you know, back in those days, you know, even though it's not that long ago, actually so much has changed in the industry, and on Eternal Sunshine, we were a couple of very, very few women on that set. You know, it was a very male-dominated world, and so we kind of clung to each other just because there wasn't anyone else. And we remained very close friends over the years. And then we did A Little Chaos together, which was Alan Rickman's last film that he directed back in 2012. And as time went by and I started developing Lee, I realized there was just no way I could ask a man to direct the film. It just wouldn't have been in line with the rhythm that was required. And Ellen at this point had started directing television. And also Ellen is in her 60s and she has partial hearing. And she says herself that for the longest time, she just did not have the courage to transition into directing because she just simply couldn't hear what people were saying. So for a long time, she hid behind the lens. And of course, that's what Lee did. Right. Lee hid behind the lens. And her way of dealing with the injustice that she had been served as a young girl was to try and fight for justice for others in a visual way. And so I just suddenly went, oh my God, I've got to ask Ellen to do the film. And I asked her, and of course she was like, yes. And so that was how that part began. And it just made the most sense because of Ellen's skill in telling stories in such a brilliant visual form. I knew that we would come at it as friends, as a team, and do it together, and that's very much what we did.
I know it's very difficult to describe how you approach a performance because it's so complex, and your performance is incredible in this. But is there any kind of starting points that you could share with us, or any sort of key sort of aspects of her personality that you sort of held dear and had in your mind at the whole time?
Well, I spent so much time with Tony in the archive. I mean, really, all of these years up until now. I mean, he was just messaging me today and he was making a joke. He was like, oh, ha, 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 it doesn't have to stop here. You know, we could do the TV version. I'm like, I sent him one of those throwing up emojis. I was like, bleh. So because I spent so much time really getting to know him, I was, of course, getting to know her. And I had my hands fully immersed in her world, from everything to her clothes, to her camera kit, to letters between her and Audrey Withers, to letters between her and Roland, and countless other gentlemen she had met along the way. And I just would walk into this world that was her. And so I think over a period of time, my preparation was becoming more and more automatic and more in me. And then actually when we came to really prepping the film, and so what that means is when you put the costumes together and you really start to build the relationships with the cast, and you actually think about where you're going to film this thing and who's going to do the music and, you know, all of that stuff. As that started to really come to life, and it sounds small, but it's a big deal when you put on the costumes. When I first put on her war uniform, I mean, it is a replica. I mean, I have photos of myself with an IKEA tape measure measuring her actual uniform, going, no, we're 2 millimeters out. Michael, we're going to have to go back in, our costume designer. So the attention to detail was such that it helped us all to feel like we were these people. And, you know, sometimes you can often, as an actor, you know, you can cross a bit of a line sometimes, and you start to sort of become them a bit. And it's a little bit scary when that happens, but we did have quite a bit of that. Andrea and I in particular, we had quite a lot of that.
Can you give me some examples?
Oh, God. Oh, so the scene with the cutting of the negatives. So the thing that was so hard about that scene was that, first of all, we had to shoot that in the morning, and in the afternoon, we had to shoot Lee and Audrey sitting on the stairs in the scene that immediately follows. So it was a whopper of a day. But that really happened. So in my research, I met someone who's now in her 90s, who was a 15-year-old girl working as an assistant for Audrey Withers at Vogue. And I was having tea with her in Kent, and she said, God, I just remembered something. There was a day when Lee came in. She was really drunk, Kate. I shouldn't tell you that, but she was really very drunk and angry about something. And she came into the offices, And she started going through the filing cabinets, and she grabbed my scissors off the desk, and she just started hacking into these negatives, hacking like someone possessed. I said, oh my God, Pam. I said, well, what did you do? She said, I put on my big girl voice, and I said to her, now you look here, Lee Miller. Those are my good scissors. You jolly well give them back. And she stopped cutting. She stopped the cutting, and she looked at Pam, and she handed them back, and she stopped. And so we always knew the scene would have to be in. And so for Andrea and I, knowing that we were recreating something that had really happened, I mean, we just felt, I think I was sick at one point. Andrea and I couldn't really even look at each other all day. We just had to do it. And also the scene that follows, where Lee does reveal to Audrey what had happened to her when she was 7 years old. There had been so many versions of that scene, I can't tell you the number of drafts. And I always knew there's no point over fiddling with this, because I'm just going to phone Tony the night before and he and I will just write it. And that's what we did.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Right.
And I called him from my room. I was sharing an apartment with Kate, my producing partner who's here, because we had to live together because we just had so much to do. We'd get home from work and we would think about the next day and, okay, can we afford to pay for that street? No, we can't. Okay, we're going to change that scene. Okay, you phone so-and-so and I'll phone so-and-so. We're like, great. So that's how it would go. And I went to my room and I called Tony and I said, T, I'm doing the scene tomorrow. He said, okay. He said, what should we do? I said, we're going to write it. I said, just tell me again. And he told me again how he himself had found out. And he was writing the book, Lives of Lee Miller, and he just kept feeling that there was something he couldn't put his finger on. And he had really gone on sort of a wild goose chase, and he'd, traveled the world and spent time with Davy Sherman, because Davy at the time was still alive, and spent time with Lee's brothers, John and Eric. And he went and he sat with his uncles, John and Eric, and he said, there's something, isn't there? And they said, yeah. And they told him. And she'd never told anyone. She hadn't even told Roland. So it's heartbreaking to think that this woman lived with this injustice that she never shared, not even with a friend. I met another woman named Bettina McNulty, who was the editor of House and Gardens magazine at the time that Lee did some work for them. And they were close. Bettina isn't around anymore. And she'd had a stroke when I met her. And I did ask her, I said, Bettina, did Lee ever tell you what had happened to her? And she just went like that and then looked down. And I thought, my God, maybe you do know. So I keep getting emotional, it's so ridiculous. But for a woman as powerful and extraordinary as Lee, to have lived her life without anger and no malice towards men, strangely. She loved men and she enjoyed her relationships with men. But the power that she had to overcome that trauma and to put it into her visual work and giving a voice to the voiceless victims of conflict, I just thought, someone's got to tell that story. And so I did it. But yes, it was after many, many, many months, hours, years with Tony Penrose.
And in terms of the photographs that she chose to take and the photographs that you choose to sort of drive the narrative with, you and the writers, it's interesting to look at the focus on women and girls in particular sometimes, and the kind of some of the moments, very, very striking moments in this film that we see. The woman she gives the knife to, the woman whose hair is cut off. I found those incredibly affecting. And then, as you say, knowing what we now know about her as well, that sort of empathy, but the shame and the difficulty she had, but the importance in documenting that.
Yeah.
Is there, anything you wanted to say about
Lee
that?
was utterly driven by passion, compassion, and respect for other people, in particular women. And she had empathy for those female collaborators, and you can see it in her real images of the women with the shaved heads being shamed in the streets. And those head shaving scenes, they were in the script, they were out, and we always knew somehow we had to put it in. And it was difficult, actually, because that first part of the film is very heavily front-loaded. When you get to San Marlo and a lot happens there, and then she finds Davy, and we have obviously the heartbreaking head-shaving scene. And actually casting those parts was really hard because, first of all, you have to find women who are happy to have their heads shaved. lo and behold, they went, me, pick me. I mean, they were just amazing. And they understood the importance of that scene and that part of the story. But our actress who plays the woman who we feel Lee has that proper connection with, she was incredible. She did an audition. They all had to audition. It's obviously a very small scene when they're just talking downstairs with the Breton woman who's accusing her of being a whore. It's a short scene. But we then asked these actresses who auditioned for us, and there were many. We said, look, is there any way, would you mind improvising someone shaving your head? And the actress we are blessed to have, she is a dancer, actually. And there was something about her fragility, but her muscular strength, that it came out of every part of her face. It's hard to describe. And she had got someone, she'd got a man with huge arms to come in and improvise. We never saw his face. So she'd almost kind of staged this scene herself in a way that then kind of became inspiring to how we ended up shooting it. We were like, my God, that's really good. You never kind of see his face as he's doing it. Because the most important thing is that eye contact between her and Lee. One woman saying to another, I'm here and I see what's happening and I will make sure other people know. And yeah, many scenes like that. And of course the scene in Dachau with the young girl, you know, we do sadly know that there were brothels in the camps and there were children in those brothels. And Lee did photograph some of that. But it was always about finding that balance because of course, by the time we get to Dachau, we had to be absolutely ruthless with ourselves about seeing that situation through Lee's eyes, following the facts. What had she photographed? Okay, we'll photograph that. We'll photograph that. We'll photograph that. We don't need that. We don't need to see the miles and miles of tents. Because, of course, so many people have depicted the Holocaust in films brilliantly. And this isn't a film about a war, it's a film about a woman. And we just had to keep telling ourselves that. And it was hard. I mean, some of that stuff was, brutal.
When you say there are many great films about war, it makes me think that this comes to those scenes from a rather different perspective. And also the fact that, as you mentioned before, she hung out with Picasso, a more traditional film might have gone in that direction. And I think it's very interesting that you've chosen very much, you say, to make it a character portrait. I mean, what are you hoping that people will take away from this that's different to other films set in that period?
Lee Miller was such an extraordinary woman. Her work stands alone, and yet it is quite surprising how few people really know who she is. I mean, there might be people here who'd never even heard of her, or some people here may have heard of her but not realized the extent to which she was so determined to document the atrocities of the Nazi regime. And any story that celebrates the work and the legacy of any woman in history, to me, I'm there.
Yeah, me too.
So and actually, even through the development process, it just felt more and more important all the time. And there were times when believe me, there were tears and there were panic attacks and there were, it's never going to happen, we're never going to get the money, oh my God. But lots and lots of moments like that. But I would just think to myself, I've just got to keep doing it. And actually, it got to a point where I thought, I've just got to do it for Tony. I mean, if for no one else, and if it's just a piece of shit and everyone hates it, I've still got to do it for Tony. I just knew I had to because he needed it. He needed this film to be made.
Well, I feel like the world needed this film to be made, so thank you, honestly. There are certain scenes, I want to just touch on a couple more before I ask you about your co-stars, because I think that's another thing we need to touch on. But I mean, here's one co-star, Marianne Cotillard. I mean, that scene when your character Lee finds her character just devastated, my God, that was so powerful, seeing you two together. Can you talk me through that scene and the filming of it?
So Marianne is extraordinary. You look at her and her face, there's a sort of a liquidity to her face. Is that even a word? I hope it is. It sounded nice and felt nice. There's something almost translucent about her face. And in that scene in particular, you almost feel as though you could put your hand through her. She feels like such a waif of the former Solange. But what is extraordinary is that all of Marion's scenes were filmed in 6 consecutive days, and that scene was her first day. I know. And she said, I looked at the schedule and I was like, oh, the fuckers, whatever. And sometimes that happens. I did a TV thing called Mayor of Easttown. The scene when she figures out who actually killed the girl, day 2 of a 1-year shoot. I'm like, fuckers. So sometimes it does happen that way round. But she was just amazing. She was just incredible. And all of them, I mean, that time that we had with them, we really did Mougins, all that stuff in the south of France. We filmed in Croatia for that sequence. Turns out France is really expensive to film in. So we went to Dubrovnik, which was amazing. And we had all of those guys for that 1 week. Overlapped a little bit with Alex Skarsgård, who joined us towards the end and then stayed with us for a little bit longer after that. Mm-hmm. And then came back once, I think, as well towards the end. But all those actors, what was so amazing, oh my God, they just loved each other. They all just came together and they had the best time. And they just treated it like this great dinner party they'd accidentally been invited to. And we're just delighted to kind of show up and go, oh my God, this is so much fun. And we were lucky it didn't rain. Like, you know, everyone knew their lines, like phew. But they were all just wonderful. And having Noémie Merlan, who plays Noosh, I mean, my God. Yeah. And when we see her again, when Lee finds them in Paris, she's just, I mean, it's just heartbreaking. I mean, yeah, there were many days when we would be in states of extreme sort of elation in the south of France, and then others when we would just be on our knees. And it's, you know, filming's like that sometimes. It's like that sometimes, but it certainly helps to have, you know, people in your corner who are so powerful as performers and lovely, lovely people. We didn't have one bad egg. Oh, phew. Sometimes, you know, if it just take one slightly minty one, you'll be like, oh, okay, you're going to have to make you laugh. And so, everyone got along great.
You mentioned sort of making laugh, but actually Lee's sense of humour is something that is a feature in the film, although, of course, it's a very serious film, but I love her dry sense of humour and how she often uses it to make people feel more comfortable or uncomfortable, depending on her mood.
Yes, like she did have she was pretty raucous, you know, she absolutely had a wild sense of humour. And actually, there were many more scenes with Picasso in versions years ago, 7-8 years ago. And he actually really became a character. And just more and more we realized, hang on, we can't, it's going to look gimmicky if we do this. And it's going to detract from the story we really do need to tell. So little by little, poor old Picasso was just slightly reduced to a smaller role, although incredibly important. But Picasso seemed to really understand Lee. And, you know, she hated her teeth. She actually had terrible, really terrible teeth, like tombstones, awful teeth. And so she would never, if you look at pictures of her, you're all going to go and Google. If you look at pictures of her, she's always smiling, either like this or in profile. She loved her profile, hated her teeth. So it's usually an in profile, closed mouth smile. But Picasso famously painted her with this huge smile and all her teeth like posts. And he was the only person that she would really like smile for like that. So yeah, so he captured her in that way, which again, of course, she, you know, I think probably slightly reluctantly had a sense of humour about.
Yeah, I've seen that painting. It's amazing.
Yeah, amazing.
Any heads of department you want to mention? Because I know Ellen is extraordinary and we don't have time to go into everyone, but, you know, obviously everyone's at the top of their game here.
Well, I walked onto the set on day one and our A-camera operator had been the A-camera operator on The Reader. And there's so much to be said for building these friendships and relationships with people over the years that really hold. They are steadfast things, you know, and you go through these experiences together and then you never forget. And so when you're thrown into another one, you sort of hang on to one another and then you're in it as a unit. Richard Stiles, our first AD, he was a little floor runner when I did Hamlet at Shepperton years ago, and he'd go up and down on his skateboard making people cups of tea, a floor runner, and he is now a first assistant director. And when I knew that we finally had the money to make the film, he was the first crew member I called and said, Richard, you got to come. And actually, he was in prep for something else, and he said, oh, I can come, I'm going to make it work. So we had people showing up for us. And Michael O'Connor, our costume designer, he was a costume supervisor on a film I did called Quills when I was 22, and he since did The Duchess, and now he's done, he's an absolutely extraordinary person. And Ivana Primorac, I love dearly, and I've done many, many things with her since The Reader, including Mayor of Easttown. we were just so blessed. But there is a story that is the only time I really like got giddy and stupid in the whole process of like, oh, fuck, we've got that person. And, I mean, I did have lots of moments like that, but this was a real like, oh my God, okay, it really is happening now. Ellen and I did a Zoom call with Alexandre Desplat, thinking there's absolutely no way he's going to say yes to us. We literally could pay him £2.50, and he's just not going to do it. And so we got on this Zoom thinking we were kind of pitching, and we're like, oh, hi, thank you, really nice of you, your busy schedule, a very important composer, to speak to us. And he said, well, ladies, I'm so excited to join you. When do we start? And Ellen and I both were like, what? Oh my God, are you going to just do it? And he was like, oh, yes, I'm sorry. I thought that had been communicated. I would love to make this. And we both burst into tears. It was pathetic. We were just like, oh, God, sorry, we're a little bit overcome. And we just couldn't keep it together. Because when you get someone like that, and then cut to when we're actually scoring in Abbey Road, on the stage where the Beatles recorded, I mean, come on. It was just unbelievable. And even then, I'm looking through the sound booth window, and I can see this 150-piece orchestra, and I'm thinking, sure, I recognise that violinist. That's weird. Anyway, we carry on. And at the end, it was a wrap for the day, and this violinist stands up and goes, it's me. And I'm thinking, I do know him. Who is it? I went in, and at the end of Titanic, when they start playing, he was that guy! I'm like, oh my God, it's you! It was actually him! It was actually that guy! And he had scored part of our film. I mean, it was just, he had played part of the music from it. It was just, honestly, unbelievable. So we had lots and lots of moments like that one. So I suppose all I can tell you is that, honestly, making this film was so hard, but worth every moment, because I'm so proud of the film, and for all of those experiences that we had of everyone coming together like that, and people I met when I was 18, 19, 20, when I was doing Titanic. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It makes me feel like, wow, I'm one of those old people who's been around for it. Yeah, that definitely, I definitely had a few of those moments. But yeah, it feels such a relief that we've done it.
Yeah, well, congratulations again. It really is extraordinary. And I presume now Lee sort of enters the kind of canon in your mind of all the characters that you played that you feel very affectionate about and very attached to.
Well, Lee, I honestly, it's not often that I can say, oh, I was really affected by that role or inspired by that character. But out of all the roles I've played, honestly, I have been utterly inspired by Lee. And I feel I've sort of made almost shifts in my own life as a woman, just personal choices about how I live, how I feel about my physical self, just walking through the world, holding my head higher and thinking, actually, yeah, I've got some stuff to say, And I feel I've always done that, but you have to sort of shape it in a certain way. But Lee was just Lee. She didn't shape any part of herself to suit anyone. She was just front and center, living life, full throttle. And I think, okay, life is short. I'm going to do that. And that's what she's done for me.
What an inspiration.
Yeah, so inspired by her.
So the film is out in UK and Irish cinemas on the 13th of September. And Kate, thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.